What's the meanest thing your husband has ever said to you? My parents adored him and saw potential in him. His parents really enjoyed having me around and frequently invited me to their family functions. I was the only one who ever called him Danny and even had asked if it was alright to call him that. To which he smiled and replied, "I'll always be your Danny." Danny was in a horrific car crash when I was a junior in late December. He was T-boned by a truck driver who was high on powder and had been drinking. The driver ran a red light which ended up plowing Danny into the light-changing post. The force spun his car and it easily could have nosedived into the river if it weren't for a tree that caught the edge of the front end, making the car come to a standstill. He had a shattered jaw, broken collarbone and a punctured lung. For 2 seemingly long and painstakingly days after his emergency surgery, he was in a coma and placed in the ICU. Tubes and wires were everywhere, followed by the sounds of the breathing machine and the heart monitor and whatever else so-called gizmos they had him hooked up to. The only time I left his side was to go to the bathroom. His mom allowed me to stay the entire time. He was barely recognizable as his face was 3 times the size it should have been. Bruises and cuts covered him and of course the endless supply of tubes and wires. I was never happier when he finally opened his eyes and looked at me, tried to smile, followed by a squeeze of my hand. My Danny had made it back to us and he was going to be all right. After his long recovery, one day he got it in his head that he really wanted to serve the country. He had romanticized the idea of being a hero and that we would be able to afford college, since his family wasn't very well off. While I admired and always thanked veterans for serving, I just had a bad feeling about Danny enlisting. For some reason, deep down, I knew the day he would leave for training would be the day that my Danny died. Not wanting to be selfish, I communicated where I stood with the whole idea and how I had a bad feeling about it. But if this was something he felt that he needed to do, then I'd support him 110% and would be right here waiting for him to come home to me. After he dodged a few red flags, like having a metal plate in his jaw which the military may not accept readily, Danny succeeded in enlisting. Before I knew it, we were saying goodbye to each other. After he left, I cried myself to sleep every night, and I couldn't understand why. I just did. I wrote uplifting letters to him daily and counted down the days for his graduation. The day finally came when we got to attend the ceremony, and we were finally reunited in joyful smiles and tears. It was then that I thought perhaps I was just being paranoid and that maybe everything would be all right. At least I desperately wanted it to be. Yet I had this nagging feeling that he was somehow different. I couldn't put my finger on it and shrugged it off. A few days after he came home after graduating from advanced individual training, I was overjoyed in having him home. I didn't care that somehow he wasn't Danny, that something was off. The Daniel that came back was short-tempered. He seemed angry at the world and was no longer organized. His car was constantly full of garbage. His room was a disaster. For the first time, we actually got into heated arguments versus calmly talking things out and trusting the other would be heard and have a turn. Another red flag I had ignored was my dog's reaction to him. When he first stepped through the door, my dog had literally bolted from the room, refusing to have anything to do with him. This was a dog that loved to wiggle her butt and push her nose into your calf for attention from visitors. As time passed by, it became harder and harder to ignore the fact that Danny was no longer there and in his place was this man who looked like him, smelled like him, walked like him, talked like him.